You got a man cave, a garage, a bar, a house that has signs in it? Well, let me help you out, people. Go to Facebook and follow Kelly Burgeon or Instagram K_Burgeon_designs. Kelly is absolutely phenomenal in his work. He can make memories matter. His detail and the nostalgia he brings to life is unbelievable. I've been honored in the past to receive pieces of his work, and I cannot get over how well these things are. The Sands, Stardust, and recently the Surf Ballroom and intersection signs of where the Buddy Holly crash site happened. If you don't believe me, look at his work on his Instagram or his Facebook. Trust me, reach out to Kelly. You'll be glad you did, as am I. Hey, everybody, it's Tommy Canale, and welcome back to Before the Lights podcast, the show that tells you how they made their mark. Today, he's a former film and digital editor at Wide World of Sports and Paramount Pictures. He was an on-air host in LA and produced the nominated Caravans Cubana late night sessions. He has written Glenfiddich Inn and a family memoir called Uncle Charlie Killed Dutch Schultz, The Jewish Mob, A Family Affair. Let's welcome in Alan Geik. Alan, how are you?
I'm great, and thank you so much for having me on your show, Tommy.
You are more than welcome. We are here once again at the Lemon Tree Café and Market in Las Vegas, located at 6111 South Buffalo Drive, Suite 150. Go to lemontreecafelasvegas.com, or you can follow them on Instagram at Lemon Tree Café and Market. You can also click a link in the show notes. But if you're going to come here, and I highly suggest you do, because it has a great vibe. They have Lavazza coffee, house-made pastries, a full high tea service, great dining room seating, and a wood-fired pizza oven. Alan, you and I were talking. It's a great place.
I love it. I've never been here before. I'm definitely coming back.
Well, let's get into it. You lived in London from 66 to 68, which is a great era of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones.
Yes.
How was that?
It was a great time to be there. I went not as a lark, but I wound up I got invited by a professor to said, come to the London School of Economics. I used to argue with him at City College. And so I wound up going there and getting a master's degree. And then I said, this is great. And I taught in a college in London. It was the best time to be there. As you mentioned, the Rolling Stones, the Beatles. It was such an alive city. But I wanted to be in the film business and not be in an academic world. So I wound up going back to New York and working in the sports business, which was great fun, too, because every day was D-Day. Every show had its own deadline the next weekend. And as we used to joke, you could die, but you can't get sick. That would be the only excuse for not finishing a job, was that you died. So I wound up moving out to L.A. in the late 70s. But London was a great place to be, a great experience.
So how did you become a film editor at Wide World of Sports?
Well, when I came back from England for a while, I was looking for a job. I didn't want to be in the film, in the academic world or financial world. So I said, I really want to be in the film business. So I wound up applying for a job as a film editor without even really knowing what it was. And the guy who was doing the hiring was a guy from my neighborhood in the Bronx. He said, well, why don't you work here for a few weeks? So I wound up, he said, you'll find a job through us. So I wound up working in a film lab in New York as a customer service person. And the first people that came in were two guys from L.A. who were producing a show for Time Life Film called The World of Sports Illustrated. It was the poor man's a wide world of sports. And they hired me because I knew the labs, and I had been there maybe an hour. I didn't even know where the coffee was. And so they hired me, and the next week I went from the lowest level to moved up in the editing world. And from then on, I just kept getting jobs in the sports business. And I wound up working at Wide World of Sports, which at the time was like the highest level of being in the sports business. But I said, I really want to be in the film business. So I moved to L.A. with no job. and it worked out fine.
You couldn't get that job like that these days.
No way. And you couldn't even move. I mean, mobility is so much less now than it was in the late 60s, 70s, 80s. As you said, you have a job now, unless maybe in IT or some specialized areas, but I could have never moved out to L.A. My rent at the time was, when I moved to L.A., was about $450 for a two-bedroom apartment 2 blocks from the beach.
Oh.
So, as you said, I would have needed a lot of income right away just to live in L.A. now.
Yeah. You had a 25-year stint in L.A., though, as a public on-air host. How did that all come about?
Another lucky thing, I listened to an Afro-Cuban show. I always liked that music, among other kinds of music. And I called up a guy on a radio show right after I got the job at Paramount. Within the same month, everything changed. And I said to him, well, what are you doing here? He said, on this late night show, he said, I'm just here till I could find someone to take over for me. So I never thought of being a radio host. I said, well, what about me? He said, come by next week. And I did. And I said, oh, this will be fun for a few months to do this radio show. 25 years later, I was still doing it. And I made $20 in 25 years. It was a public radio show, and a $20 bribe I didn't take. It would have been an even $100. But we all joke about it because, and the show, for a college radio show, to be on the air for 50 years is pretty extraordinary. And we just had, I went to LA for the 50th anniversary festival on the lawn of the campus. There were thousands of people there, and it was sort of a family, and it still is. And I may go back and do the show and send them in from Las Vegas.
Oh, that'd be great. Hopefully you get more than $20.
Yeah, maybe.
Your father was Lou.
Yes.
He was not allowed into the organized crime by your uncles.
Correct.
But was he connected?
It's interesting you asked that, Tommy, because a few people along the way since I had the book out, it seems so odd because he was so close to them and he did things for them. And but he himself was never arrested. He had no criminal history, and he was nowhere involved as the other ones were, who were arrested many times and who had that kind of reputation. But we do remember FBI coming to the house one time just to checking on Uncle George, and who was by that point a big shot in Las Vegas. But my father, I called him mob adjacent more recently because they all respected him, and he wound up in the trucking. But he was, for most of my youth, he was a manager of a shipping department in a music publishing company. He knew all the American Songbook, Gershwin and Cole Porter. My mother did too. And we lived in the Bronx, 5 of us in a 2-bedroom apartment. We never thought we were not poor. We were working class family. And he wound up getting fired, and on his out, he must have been at the time 45 years old with no real education for jobs and skills, and he wound up getting becoming a partner in the trucking business. And the only way you can be in the garment center at that time was to be well connected, which he was, and they helped him become one of the partners. The other partners loved him because the whole garment center was open to them now, and they're still in business, and they it wasn't like they put him in and he brought the business down. He really allowed them to have a place in the trucking business, and they had clients like Macy's and Lord & Taylor and things like that because of his connections.
Listeners, what I want you to do is go to the show notes and get your hands on this book, Uncle Charlie Killed Dutch Schultz, The Jewish Mob, A Family Affair. We're going to get into about Uncle Charlie and Dutch Schultz, but the book is much more than that. It's the title, but it's more of a family memoir. And I'm going to give you a little bit about it, but not all of it. And to kind of keep going here, when did you know, Alan, that your family was connected? Because from the book, they had part in 200 bars in Manhattan.
Yeah, that was one of the extended family that I came to much later in the Oh, no, actually, I shouldn't say that because they were at my bar mitzvah when I was 13. And I knew who all these people were. We knew Uncle Charlie was in jail. I didn't call him Uncle Charlie at the time, but we knew this man was in jail who was an integral part of the wider family crime culture. And we would meet him when I was in my mid-20s. But I always knew that these people, who they were, but it seemed so normal to us. When I'm asked about it, it was just normal. These were our uncles. I mean, I knew their children who were my age or a little older. I respected them in the same way I would everybody else. And every so often I'd pick up a newspaper and see a picture of, there's Sammy Goldstein, there's so-and-so, there's an article in a paper about Skim in Las Vegas, but by then I was probably in high school. And there was Uncle George is mentioned in it. And so we always were aware of it. My brother was a detective in New York at the time, but what made that interesting was that they treated him in a different way. They were not afraid of the police. They loved sharing their stories, and he loved telling them stories about his world as well. And my sister my brother passed away. My sister is an attorney in Boston, and she was really interested in it because of the women. She sat with the women whose stories I was never interested in. I was interested in the men's stories.
Sure.
But as I got older, I realized the women's stories were more poignant and more perceptive in a lot of ways because they were the ones who had to take care of the family if the men went away for jail 3, 4, 5 years. And ironically, as soon as the men got out of jail, they found girlfriends. So the women were always, at that time, that was almost inevitable.
Yeah.
And it was part of that culture, of the men's culture. So we were always aware of who these people were, but it was, we always loved seeing them. And we also, my mother's side of the family had none of them. It was all my father's side. My mother were Greek Jews, and they spoke Greek. We never learned it. Family secrets among them. But so we always were connected to a reality of normal aunts and uncles with the normal family interactions.
We talked just a little bit about Uncle Charlie was in jail and you met him in your 20s, but explain to me and my listeners, who was Waxey Gordon?
Waxey Gordon was one of the old-time bootleggers. He was one of the mob bosses in the 20s, in the late 20s, and into the very early 30s. He was a few years older than the two men who were taking over the mob in New York, Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky, and he never accepted their leadership. Because he was older, he was a little more out on the street. And so they ultimately had to take him out, and they did it by setting him up for tax evasion because Al Capone had just been convicted of tax evasion. And so the New York authorities went after Waxey Gordon, and the people who provided a lot of information of his tax records were allegedly Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano, to get him out of the way. But he was a mob boss, and years later, this was in the 30s, but in 1951, he got arrested with 3 other men in a drug sting, and 2 of the men were the closest people to my family I could ever imagine, Sammy and Benny Kass. And Sammy had been Waxey Gordon's right-hand man when he was a teenager in the early 30s. And so Sammy told us a lot of the history of him and Waxey Gordon, and he wound up going to jail for 15 years. And Waxey Gordon, when he got arrested, he knew it was the end of the line. And there's a picture in the book of the 4 of them standing in a wall in the police station, and you look at Waxey Gordon, and you know he died 2 years later in prison.
So how did Waxey's imprisonment pave the way for Arthur Flegenheimer, which is known as Dutch Schultz? Dutch was a bootlegger, speakeasy owner, labor racketeer, bouncer, and a killer, mainly in the Bronx and Harlem, New York. He was clearing 10 to 20,000 a year from the numbers rackets.
Million or
Millions.
He would. I don't. Yes.
So was it Waxey's imprisonment that gave Dutch the leeway to go forward?
I would say, and this is from my own research writing for the book, I wanted to get a lot of these facts. Both Waxey Gordon and Dutch Schultz were on the outs with the organized crime. The people who, it's interesting, they were organizing crime in the late 20s, but it was really becoming more of a corporate structure. And the two people, both who were on the outs for their own reason, were Waxey Gordon and Dutch Schultz, because of their personality. They just couldn't fit into this corporate structure. And they had just taken out two old-time Italian bosses, Masseria and Maranzano, and now they went after Waxey Gordon and Dutch Schultz, because these were the kind of people they had a bigger picture. They had a corporate picture. So when Waxey Gordon went to jail, I can't say that they were related in any way, because as soon as Waxey Gordon went to jail, Dutch Schultz was on his decline. He was always on the outs. The way he dressed more like a vagrant, as one reporter called him. He wasn't. He just didn't have what it took to be one of these corporate executives of sorts, mob corporate executives.
The numbers racket was a huge, big money situation back in those days, and the number collectors would rent apartments as out-of-the-way offices for a few hours each afternoon after the last horse race was finished. Tell us about Mrs. Louise, who lived across the way from you in apartment 25.
Mr. and Mrs. Lewis lived across. We were in apartment 21, and they were in the Bronx, and it was very normal. All of these, there were like 60 apartments in one building and maybe 10 buildings on a block. So you can imagine how many people were there. But I was always aware of single men or single women having a one-bedroom apartment, living very quietly and outbuilding in other buildings. I always respected. And my father pointed out to me when I was very young, a lot of them were being financed by the mob. Maybe their husband died in some mob-related activity. There was no Social Security. Remember, we're talking about 50s and 60s. These guys didn't sign up for Social Security in the 30s. And so they were taken care of by the mob. And one of the things the numbers people found very attractive was they could settle their books, however they did that, after, as you mentioned, the last racetrack, because one of the numbers would be printed in the newspaper in the total mutual handle, the amount of money betted during the whole day. The last three digits would be that number. So they would go in and figure out who to pay, and they did it away from the street. And Mrs. Lewis many times would say to me, "Alan, could you go out and get me a nice coffee cake?" She would knock on the door. "Is Alan home?" Because I would be the one who would do that. My brother was older. My sister, they weren't going to send out to do it. So I'd go to the bakery and come back with a coffee cake and get a pat on the head from Mrs. Lewis. And she would leave and often come into our house our apartment when these men would come and do whatever they want. We knew them by sight. They knew us. It was so normal.
It was just a normal day.
Normal day.
How did Dutch Schultz's greed for money and becoming the operator of the Coney Island racetrack in Cincinnati figure into his demise?
Well, a lot of the history revolves around him wanting to. He was targeted by the governor of New York, Governor Lehman, who hired Thomas Dewey, a young prosecutor who had just prosecuted, I believe, Waxey Gordon, and Dutch Schultz wanted to kill him. And that was out of bounds for this new organization, organized crime, and they said, no, you can't do it. So that was often the way that it was perceived that, and that I'm sure was the largest part. But he also owned a racetrack, or he was partners with a racetrack, had some managerial or ownership in a racetrack outside of Cincinnati. And what that did for him, he didn't see that if someone won the number and it got collected a 600 to 1 and a 900 to 1 bet, you'd want to take those bets. That's your best advertisement in the neighborhood. Someone won, and
Right.
they go, here's your money, and they're walking around buying drinks for everybody. What could be better advertisement? He just couldn't give up that $600 or $60 as it might have been to someone who bet a penny or a dime or whatever it was. So he fixed the number at the racetrack. They used his racetrack in Cincinnati instead of any of the other ones. Somehow he was able to manage that. And he hired a mathematician who got killed with him, who had just come back. And the guys in Cleveland, I knew this to be true because Uncle George was, by this point, integral part of the Cleveland syndicate that wanted the racetrack, and they were moving south into Cincinnati, and they wanted the racetrack, and they had been talking to Dutch Schultz about a piece of that action because that was in their turf in Ohio. And so Dutch, so the night, supposedly, even the night before the mathematician who was able to fix the number, they were talking to him, the Cleveland Syndicate. He came back to New York and he got killed the next day or within a very short time, along with two other guys and Dutch Schultz. But that was the point of the racetrack for Dutch Schultz, was to never give out a dime when it was the best money you could have spent to have a few winners.
You mentioned Uncle Charlie killed Dutch Schultz in the Palace Chophouse in Newark, New Jersey at approximately 10:15 p.m. on October 23rd, 1935. Louis Lepke had Murder Incorporated, which was an organized crime hit squad, picked out one of his most reliable gunmen and your Uncle Charlie.
That's right. And as I mentioned a little earlier, of course, I didn't know Uncle Charlie till he got out of jail. And but one of the reasons for the title of the book, and I said it when I was at the Mob Museum, it was the first time it really occurred to me as I was talking. The first thing I wrote when I wrote the book was Uncle Charlie Killed Dutch Schultz, and then it was a blank page. And 2 or 3 years later, there were 60,000 words changed around in paragraphs and chapters and photographs. The only thing that stayed the same was Uncle Charlie Killed Dutch Schultz. And one of the reasons was I remembered when he was in jail and we knew of him and his sort of reputation and that event, because it was replayed a lot of times in TV shows. Charlie was a 25-year-old guy, goes into the chop house with Mendy Weiss, and they shoot it out with 4 men. They kill all 4 of them, Dutch Schultz being one of them. And then he goes through Dutch Schultz's pocket, takes out $8,000, and when he comes back out, the car left. It was a big deal among him and his partner, and he walked all the way back to Manhattan or Brooklyn. He was at 25, and so this was the guy we knew of. And when he got out of jail, he was no longer 25 years old. And my brother and I, one of us said, did Uncle, by this point we were calling him Uncle Charlie, did Uncle Charlie really kill Dutch Schultz? Not pointing at him, but when my father heard that, he said, don't ever take Charlie. Don't underestimate Charlie. Trust me, Charlie killed Dutch Schultz, and Charlie is still a bad guy. I mean, not bad in the sense he was always charming and delightful with us. But the reason why we called him Uncle Charlie, he was very close to my Uncle George, who was a main character, most successful of all the organized crime figures, and my parents, both my mother and my father. But when he was in jail, my father was one of the men who brought money to the family over the 23 years. And they specifically wanted people like him who had no criminal record. Going back to the point you asked earlier, this was one of his functions. He would bring money to him. And Charlie, when he got out of jail, was very appreciative of that. And also, when he got out of jail, he was nervous about, he had a reputation, and he was nervous about the parole board coming after him and trying to make a reputation for making a reputation and trying to put him back in jail. But my brother was a detective, and he said, don't ever worry about that. We'll take care of the parole people, because my brother had his own connections in the very corrupt New York Police Department of that era. So Charlie always referred to us as his nephews. He called me his nephew whenever he introduced me, and I could never think of calling him anything but Uncle Charlie.
Charlie and Mendy Weiss had a falling out after that murder.
Correct.
Because Mendy pretty much took off and left Dutch, as you said, he had to walk. But it gets a little farther with Abe Kid Twist Ruelas, who becomes an informant and basically tells that Charlie killed Dutch Schultz, and then Uncle Charlie received a life sentence.
Correct.
Where did Abe Ruelas come into this whole picture?
He was one of the Murder Incorporated hitmen.
Okay.
He had a position of fairly high up in that hierarchy, and a new DA took over in Brooklyn, and no one really thought all these murders had an organization behind it. There was just a lot of murders in New York and Brooklyn, and this DA named William O'Dwyer, who was born in Ireland, a laborer, policeman, became DA. He went after them, and a few lucky breaks, which I went through in the book. Abe Ruelas wound up informing on Murder Incorporated, and as soon as it became obvious that it was a group of hired hitmen under, as you mentioned, Lepke and Albert Anastasia, a reporter called it Murder Incorporated for the first time, and the name stuck to this day. Here we are 80 years later talking about Murder Incorporated. And Abe Ruelas and another one of the hitmen, TikTok, Tannenbaum, his name was, they both were ready to testify against Uncle Charlie. And a lot of them, they were getting convicted. As soon as this case broke open, it wasn't like now, you get a death sentence, you're going the next month. And so to avoid the death sentence, he pleaded no contest and got a life sentence, and he was paroled after 23 years. But one of the, when you asked earlier about how this all appeared as a younger person, I remember walking on the boardwalk in Coney Island with a few, my father, some of his friends, maybe my mother was there too. And we walked by and someone pointed to the building that Abe Ruelas was thrown out of a hotel. Supposedly he jumped or was trying to escape with
He was
bed sheets,
forcibly.
It was. I mean, it was ridiculous. He was. They had him in a hotel under heavy guard because he was testifying against everybody. And someone pointed out and said, "Oh, that's the building Abe Ruelas was. He was thrown out that window." And I said, I was 9. I said, "You mean someone was thrown out of a window?" And then they said, "Yeah, the police threw him out. The police threw him out of a window." I was 9 years old. And they said, "Yeah, and it was right near the fun house." And this was their jokes. That was their idea of dad jokes at the time.
You brought up Sammy Kass earlier. What was his impact on how Murder Incorporated was so effective?
Sammy, from what I understood from my father, brother, and bits and pieces from Sammy, he was very close to us for his whole life. When he got out of jail after the Waxey Gordon bust in the late 60s. And Sammy worked for Waxey Gordon. He was a teenager when Waxey went to jail, and he became one of the Murder Incorporated guys, along with Uncle Charlie. They all knew each other. It was amazing. It was sort of like people in a big band in the 50s. Years later, they're all going to still know each other. And but Sammy was a young hitman. And he was the most, we always joked in the family, he was the most hardened criminal of all of them. He went from Waxey Gordon's right-hand man to being Fat Tony's right-hand man. And Fat Tony was one of the people who always looked out for my father's business. Tony went to jail around the time my father died, but my as we joked, and as the joke was, Sammy Kass was the closest Jew to Fat Tony, and they loved each other because they both had that old school mentality. So Sammy was always he was always a criminal and never anything else, but one of the more funny and lovable characters in our family culture.
Tell me about Arnold Rothstein, who was a sports fixer. He was a corruption machine. I mean, he was involved in the 1919 Black Sox with the Chicago White Sox and Cincinnati Reds. Was he connected into your family too?
No, he wasn't at all. He died. He was shot in 1928, right around the time of the presidential election, of which he had put a lot of money on. He was as we would call it now, a degenerate gambler. He grew up in a family that came to America, German Jewish family that had some money and some prestige in that community, but all he wanted to do was be on his knees shooting crap in an alleyway or in a nice illegal speakeasy at the time. And you mentioned he was the man who a lot of people credited with getting all the Jewish and Italian gangsters and probably every other ethnic group together and saying, there's so much money on the table here, why are we killing each other? It was bootleg time, the 20s, and his vision prevailed, although he didn't live to see it to its next stage, which came a few years after he passed away. But I remember my Uncle George once saying, and I heard him say this, and it really impressed me, was that Arnold Rothstein was looked up to so much in the 20s in New York by these young teenagers. My uncle was a teenager at the time, and here was Arnold Rothstein in the neighborhood coming out of places, and he came out of a doorway, and he just took a few bucks out of his pocket, and he called Uncle George over, who was 12 or 13 years old, and Arnold Rothstein is calling me over. He gave him the money. He says, you know that crap game that Nate runs down under whatever the street was? Give him this and tell. And I was like, Arnold Rothstein, he was so stunned by it. Here he was, a big-time operator in Las Vegas, and he still remembered. And he said he gave it to Nate, and he said, Arnold Rothstein gave me this to give to you. And he said he mentioned Arnold Rothstein's name and his in the same sentence. And that was a big deal to him as a 12-year-old. But one of the things that I always found interesting was that Arnold Rothstein was never found guilty of being part of the 1919. Yeah. And some people, and I don't know what's true or not, was that he knew the fix was going to happen. So he bet on who would be the winner, and he never had to put up any money. And that gave him a lot more street cred at the time. That's what I heard from those old timers. Whatever was true or not, he had a lot of street credibility because he bet on the winning side in a fixed World Series.
July 25th, 1939. The murder of Irving Penn, a music publishing executive. Why is that significant?
Well, the one of the men who was involved in that was a man named Jacob Cuppy Migden, who later became the closest family. He got me my first job in the Painters Union years later. But Cuppy was a second echelon, a Murder Incorporated guy, and Lepke wanted to take out a union official who lived in this nice building in the Bronx, not far from where I grew up years later. And Cuppy was the one who was watching, and he pointed out the wrong guy. He pointed out a business executive, Irving Penn, as you just mentioned, and they shot and killed him on the street. And his last words were supposedly to a detective, I never had an enemy in my life. And why that was significant was that up until that point, organized crime was seen as part of the community. They brought booze to people during Prohibition. They took their numbers. They took they were not enemies to these people. In the neighborhood. They had good publicity until that moment. Everything changed after that. The newspapers went after organized crime, although they still didn't know until a year later, as I mentioned. It became after Abe Relis was turned himself in. and the name Murder Incorporated became part of our vocabulary. But it was that moment that Cuppy pointed out the wrong guy. Cuppy went on, ran away. The other two guys who were involved were arrested, and Cuppy had some surgery done to his face, but they still arrested him. He did time in Sing Sing, and years later I knew him as part of the extended family organized crime culture, and I always knew about that incident ever since I was probably 10 years old. It was just, oh yeah, Cuppy pointed out the wrong guy and they killed the wrong guy. It was just a normal conversation.
The book is called Uncle Charlie Killed Dutch Schultz. Go to the show notes and click a link so you can get your copy of it. We're going to go more into the family memoir side. Eliot Ness. His personal life was in turmoil. He was drinking heavily. He had made some bad business choices. He died in 1957 from a heart attack. He is most fictionalized in the movie The Untouchables. People you knew at the time said he was a bum, and he died penniless.
Yeah, I mean, that was just one of many, let's say, counter views to public figures. And this story about Eliot Ness, as we all know, he never really captured Al Capone. Al Capone got arrested for went to jail for tax evasion, but Eliot Ness wound up moving to, of all places, Cleveland, which by that point my Uncle George and several other people related to the family were really building out these amazing gambling casinos that became the archetype for Las Vegas, which they later came to. They had, by the time they came to Las Vegas, they had 20 years experience of running illegal. And these weren't casinos on the roadside, in the back of roadside bars. These were standalone casinos with first-rate dining rooms and entertainment. All the, I think you mentioned Keely Smith when we were talking before. Louis Prima, Keely Smith, people of that stature at the time. And so Eliot Ness was there. He was the public safety director of Cleveland, and nothing ever changed. As a matter of fact, one of the jokes was that one of his chief lieutenants was had been very much involved in the numbers for decades, or for almost his whole career. I think he wound up getting arrested and going to jail. But they all saw Eliot Ness as this hapless guy, and nothing like the. You mentioned he died in 1957. I think that was around the time, a year or two before or after that, the TV show The Untouchables, and every bit of that, as I would get running commentary in my family, it was probably the most watched show in my extended family, of like how it was all wrong and a lot of BS. But Eliot Ness was always seen as a sad sack character in my family.
We brought up Uncle George many times, but he was linked to the underworld figures like George Raft, Frank Sinatra. He caught the eye of Moe Dalitz. He arranged for George to take a suitcase of cash to Meyer Lansky's crew in Saratoga Springs, New York, when he was barely 18 years old. Did this get Uncle George hooked into the life? Is that the point?
I can't say exactly, but I know my story began with him as a 12, 13-year-old climbing into the back of a dry goods store and taking money out, and him and his partner, Ruby Collard, who, incidentally, the two of them became partners for their whole life. And Ruby Collard was the one who became the president of the Desert Inn and told Howard Hughes, you got to leave now. That was Uncle George's partner for his whole life. But Ruby and George, when they were 18, George, as you mentioned, went to Meyer Lansky, and he was probably seen as a young up-and-comer, because we forget 18 then is different than 18 now.
Oh, yeah.
It wasn't like he had to sit around and think about what his career was going to be like. So 18, they were already well set into their career. And when he came back to New York, the man who mentored both of them, Ruby and Uncle George, was Trigger Mike Coppola. he took him to work in a casino in a speakeasy that had a casino, and they both managed it. They ran into trouble, and he sent him back to Moe Dalitz. Luckily, he had been there. Moe said, "Okay, bring them here. They know casino." And Moe was building out. Depression was, prohibition was coming to an end. And so they were really building out casinos as their next big grift, so to speak. And Uncle George and Ruby went there. And for the next 20 years, they managed at a very high level all of these upscale casinos in Cleveland, Cincinnati, and then in Kentucky. And then they moved to Las Vegas, where it was all legal.
Right. You mentioned Uncle George and Ruby were basically the trusted ones for decades of the Cleveland Four, the Cleveland Syndicate. And some of my listeners know the Cleveland Syndicate, and there's going to be listeners that don't. So for those of you that don't, the Cleveland Four was Morris Kleineman, Moe Dalitz, Sam Tucker, and Louis Rothkopf. They were the brains behind one of the most successful organized crime syndicates in America from 1930 into the late 1970s. How did Uncle Charlie and Uncle George and all these other people, their lives change once they got connected with the Cleveland Four?
Well, Uncle Charlie stayed in New York. He was never really directly connected with them, although for the next 5 years, from Uncle George left in 1930 with Ruby and moved to Cleveland. And Charlie was tightly involved with them for the next 10 years till he was arrested in 1941. All of these people remained connected with each other. They all did jobs for each other. And what I always found out even when I was younger, that they all invested in each other's business. They all had what they called a piece of each other's action. Trigger Mike, who was very close to Uncle George, Ruby, and Charlie, he invested as soon as they moved to Cleveland and became casino managers. Trigger Mike invested in their casino. Trigger Mike took over Dutch Schultz's numbers in New York. As soon as Dutch Schultz was dead, Trigger Mike was on the case, and he became one of the richest mobsters ever, from what I heard. Although that might be hyperbole, I can't really say that for a fact, but it was always a fact that he controlled the numbers. And what I found interesting was that the Cleveland Syndicate had money in the New York numbers racket. All of them had money in Meyer Lansky's growing casino business in Florida, and Havana, which both started in the 1930s. So long before the expression "diversify your assets" became something, these men who had very little schooling knew that that was the way to operate. Mm-hmm. And that built organized crime because they all had pieces of each other's business. And even though we hear a lot about the murders, which happened for sure, the amount of money that was changed every day was so extraordinary that it became the biggest cash flow industry in American history.
In that time period, many criminals changed their names not to embarrass their families. And their new names made them feel more American. Can you give me and my listeners a couple examples?
Well, my Uncle George, for one, his last name was Geik, which was just a shortened Russian name that always seemed weird to us. But Uncle George changed it to Gordon, and Ruben Koloditsky, I believe that was his name, changed it to Ruby Khalid. And there were a lot of the Italian men changed their names and shortened it as well. So the numbers of people, Sammy Goldstein, who I always thought of as an uncle, he was a president of a Teamsters local in New York and wound up going to jail. He changed his name to Sam Gold.
Oh,
so
gotcha.
Everything was shortened at that point.
By 1940, Uncle George and Ruby were veteran illegal gambling casino operators of the Cleveland Syndicate. In the 1950s, they would both be part of the criminal interest in the Desert Inn and the Stardust casinos. Uncle George took the Skim from the Stardust to the silent partners across the country. Was that to Kansas City? Was that to Chicago? Where was he taking the money?
I believe it was to many cities.
Okay.
And what I used, I found in my research a series of articles, investigative articles from the Chicago Sun-Times. And in the 1963, it was referenced a lot in a Senate hearings about Skim in Las Vegas. And they determined that, there was Skim and nothing ever changed, of course. But in it, Uncle George was identified as the man who brought money to Sam Giancana in Chicago, and a Cleveland boss, too. And one of the other people he brought to was Trigger Mike Coppola, who remained until his death in the mid-'60s, Uncle George's close friend and mentor. And the reason why Uncle George was the one who brought the money to Sam Giancana and Trigger Mike was because as soon as the Desert Inn opened around 1958 or so, there was a black book. The Gaming Commission had a black book in which people were not allowed into the casinos, an arbitrary book, I'm sure, but two of the names were Sam Giancana and Trigger Mike Coppola, who both had interests, and they trusted Uncle George because they knew him for so long, and they didn't trust any of the other people. There was ethnic stuff going on, too, but Uncle George was their eyes and ears in the Stardust and the Desert Inn, and he brought money to both of them. And it was really a relief, supposedly, as I read later, but I remember hearing at the time, to Moe Dalitz, who didn't want any trouble with them. He didn't need the aggravation of them thinking he was ripping them off or whatever the cut was. And that was all part of the Chicago Sun-Times. So I was glad to include that in the book as sort of not just me making up a story.
The book is good, people. You got to get it. And I'm going to end here. I have 3 stories. And the first one, if you have to rewind to catch all this, you're going to have to rewind to catch the story because this one's fascinating and I love it. Tony Cornero, a gambler who had a resume of bootlegging, illegal gambling casinos, unsolved murders, and an assassination attempt on his life. He was looking for financing for the Stardust Casino in Las Vegas. Moe Dalitz, who we've talked about, was at the Desert Inn, and he wanted control of the Stardust. So Cornero goes to Dalitz for cash, and Dalitz turns him down. Get ready, here we go. On July 31st, 1955, Tony was at the Desert Inn playing craps, and a waitress brought him a drink. He drinks it and fell to the floor dead. The whiskey glass disappeared in seconds. A physician signed the death certificate immediately. His body was taken to the mortician and was in the ground in a Los Angeles cemetery 8 hours later without an autopsy. Kicker, Moe Dalitz was on the casino floor that night.
That's right. And who took control of the Stardust? The Cleveland Syndicate, of which Moe Dalitz was the main guy.
This is probably an unsolved murder.
One of many.
It is. If I read that story, I'm like, this is classic.
It was. I felt the same way when I heard bits and pieces of it over the years, but doing research, a lot of it popped out of books for me as stories I had heard, not completely.
I'm like, this is a classic Las Vegas mob story from that time period of a guy wanting money and then drops dead to the floor, and 8 hours later, he's buried and everything's been signed and done.
That's right.
Alan, here's my question. Who was on the landline buying marijuana when an operator interrupted with an emergency call from Ezer Weizman, the president of Israel, who was looking for Lou Lenart, who was in L.A.?
Well, I was on the phone.
Oh, you were on the phone.
Now, what had happened was, just as a little backstory, my late father-in-law of my late wife, he was the first fighter pilot in the Israeli Air Force, and his name was Lou Lenart. And Ezer Weizman, who became the president of Israel, was in his group of 4, and they were friends for their whole life. And Lou was a soldier of fortune. I loved him dearly. And he came to L.A. He lived in L.A. half the year in Israel. And I'm talking about, I'm an adult now, and I'm married to his daughter. And there were landlines at the time where we would get these break-in calls. We all remember that. So I get a call I'm on the phone buying marijuana, which was illegal at the time, from a good friend of mine. He phone operator. I got an emergency call from Asa Weitzman in Israel. I picked, yes, he said, "Oh, Alan, how are you doing? I know of you, and I knew, how's lovely Nina? Yeah. Is Lou around?" And I said, "No, I don't know where he is, but I'll tell him to call you." And he said, "Oh, okay, and send my love to darling Nina." And I said, "Oh, okay, Mr. Weitzman." And I got back to my drug buying call.
Another great story.
Thank you.
Alan, tell me about meeting Meyer Lansky in 1958 and having a pastrami sandwich.
Well, before we went on the air, I think we were talking about how people were normal. There wasn't social media at the time. I knew who Meyer Lansky was from the time I was younger, but he was more like he was a part of this extended group of people. Uncle George knew him really well from the time he was 18. But to get to my father, whenever Uncle George came to town, he stayed at the Essex House or the Hampshire House, two really upscale places on Central Park South. We were in the Bronx, in the five of us in a two-bedroom apartment, so this was a big deal to go to see Uncle George, and I could order anything in room service. They didn't care. Nobody cared. So my father asked me to come down this one time, so I went to Uncle George's suite filled with guys, cigar smoke, cigarette smoke, booze around. And my father, we were going to go somewhere, and there's a man sitting at the window reading a newspaper, sun coming in. I knew who it was. It was Meyer Lansky. And my father introduces me to him, and he says, "This is my younger son, Alan." I said, "Oh, hi, Mr. Lansky." And he looks at me and he says, "Do you want a pastrami sandwich?" And it was the last thing I would have expected. But again, he was more like an older man in my neighborhood, of which I knew so many. And I said, no, thank you. And he said, "Well, why don't you share one with me?" And he thought, and he said, "You know, pastrami killed more Jews than Hitler." Now, when he said that, I broke up laughing. And looking back, and maybe I'm reading into it, he saw my reaction was so genuine. I wasn't one of the sycophants or people around him probably who were laughing at all of his jokes. And he had a smile on his face. And he said, "Now you go out and you go pick up these sandwiches at the Stage Deli," which was the go-to deli at the time, and don't tell him it's mine, tell him it's from one of the other people. And I went out and did that, and for the rest of for many years after that, whenever my brother might say, "Hey, I got a gold shield, I'm now a detective," I said, "Yeah, but I had a pastrami sandwich with Meyer Lansky." And the thing that I always remember about it was that it was just a normal, and as I think over the years it became so much more. Mm-hmm. And now it is. And when I look back, I just think of fondly of this older man sharing a joke with me.
What did you think of Meyer?
Well, I knew who he was, and I knew the respect he had, both in the Italian and Jewish community, that he really he and Lucky Luciano, who had this a great relationship for their whole lives, as many Jews and Italians did. As I mentioned in the book, it was one of the social things of interest to me of how they came together. But Meyer, in that afternoon, I also remember, which I didn't put in the book, somewhere along the way, he was talking to someone, and he said to that person, "You go kibbutz," which is a Jewish word for a Yiddish word, and I don't really speak it, for like just go and chatter, have small talk. Go kibbutz. I'm kibbutzing with the person over at the next table. And I said, "Oh, look at," because they all spoke Yiddish. All of these, just as the Italian criminals generally spoke dialects of Italian. And so I always remember he said, "Go kibitz with so-and, I want to talk to Sammy. You go kibitz with so-and-so." And the guy walked away, and Sammy came, and I left.
Alan, thanks so much for coming to the Lemon Tree, coming on the show and talking about the book.
This was great fun, and thank you so much again for having me, Tommy.
You are welcome. People, we are at the Lemon Tree Café Market, once again located 6111 South Buffalo Drive, Suite 150 in Las Vegas. Go to lemontreecafélv.com or go to Instagram and follow them at Lemon Tree Café and Market. There'll be a link in the show notes as well. In their market, you can shop from elevated selection of items such as fresh meats, imported deli meats, oils, vinegars, and more. Whether it's preparing memorable meals or you just want to come hang out, this is the place to go. That's going to do it for this episode of Before the Lights. But before we go, I got to ask you to do something for me. Take 30 seconds out of your day. Rate and review the show. 5 stars, nice comments are always appreciated. And until next time, everybody, a salute, a chin chin.